Hey everyone, welcome to another in-between episode of TeaDB. This is going to be a Q&A, so thank you to everyone who sent in your questions. Good to hear from everyone, for sure. Hope everyone has been doing well, drinking lots of tea. So yeah, thanks again to everyone that sent in questions. I'm going to do my best to answer these. So the first one is from EB. Who asked, when is the best time to enjoy tea in the day? Do you ever drink tea in the evenings? Thanks, TeaDB. Okay. I think habits tend to be very personal. I think a lot of people who had office jobs would only have time for more serious gong fu during the evening. For me, I work from home, and I tend to prefer to center my tea earlier in the day, just because it is a caffeinated beverage. Caffeine, of course, will impact people in different ways. But I tend to drink tea, probably half the tea or 2/3 the tea I drink before I eat lunch. And then I'll drink a little bit in the afternoon. I only rarely drink tea in the evenings. Sometimes, I suppose, if I have a pot going of ripe, I might go and just do a couple really late steeps later on, assuming that some of the caffeine or a good amount of caffeine has been brewed out. I tend not to do that even very much, but yeah, that tends to be my preference. But again, it depends a lot on just sort of life circumstances and what works for you and your body. Okay, so here is a question from Nathaniel Welch. Why do I never seem to get more than 8-ish steepings? I'm using a relatively high leaf to water ratio, about 1 gram per 15 milliliters, but it tends to die out pretty quickly, fairly frequently. Am I just not using great tea? What is a reasonable amount of infusions to expect? Does it correlate with tea quality or tea leaf size or something else? Having just read through Marshall's blog, I'm always surprised to see him talking about getting 10 plus and sometimes 20 plus infusions per tea. What am I missing, or do I need to recalibrate what my expectations are for what tea tastes like after half a dozen infusions? So again, there's a lot there. So yeah, it depends on a lot of things. I think one thing it definitely depends on is tea type. A tea type such as Wui Oolong, even at a really high leaf to water ratio, you're just not going to get a huge amount of flavorful steeps out of that on average. There are, of course, exceptions to that. But if you're using a 1 gram per 15 milliliter ratio, you're just not going to get that many steeps, 8-ish, or if you're okay with like more of the mineral water steeps that you'll get out of later ones, you could get 10 or 11, but you're not getting 20. Whereas something like really high quality Store Puerh, you can definitely get a lot. But then again, in the same category, a factory Store Puerh, you may only be able to get 8 or 9. So it depends a lot on the tea type as well as the tea quality. And again, it also depends on preference. Let's say you like your tea to be sharper and stronger and just on the stronger side of things. You may steep tea differently in that way versus someone that's okay getting more lightly flavored tea. So someone that you could steep the same tea with the same leaf to water ratio, but if you're steeping it very aggressively for 6 or 7 steeps, you might just get less infusions than someone that's steeping it out more slowly. So, sorry, Nathaniel, that's not necessarily a great answer because there's just a lot of different variables to consider. But yeah, I mean, it depends on a lot of different things. Last, he did ask about leaf size as well. Leaf size could matter, for sure. If you have a really, the best example I can think of is a really tippy, ripe pu'erh, will just tend to brew out faster, especially if you break it up so it's pretty loose, versus something that's larger in leaf. And some of this just has to do with like surface area. If you're getting a lot of tips in there, you're just going to be getting more surface, more water exposure to the tea leaves for the amount of tea leaves that you have. Okay, so let's see. Now we have a question from Jimmy Beans 2009. Have any advice on sourcing good tea in the U.S.? Looking for a tea shop around here because I don't want to get everything online. Pretty apt question for COVID-19 times. So locally, Yunnan Sourcing US site, I'm not sure exactly how their stock is now, but probably a pretty good place. I don't even think Crimson Lotus is currently shipping from the US, so definitely recommend Yunnan Sourcing for Pu'erh and whatever oolongs and black teas they might have. Another Taiwanese oolong vendor is Floating Leaves. They're based here in Seattle. They're also local, so I could recommend both of those places. Yeah. Do you regularly drink Japanese tea? Do you have any favorite Japanese teas? This is from Noah R. No, I don't drink Japanese green tea regularly. I do like sencha and gyokudo, but I can't say I have a favorite of the Japanese teas. I just don't drink it enough to really say. All right, so we have one from Lamau, or maybe this is a variant on LMAO. Hello, James, and anyone willing to answer. In all of the tea-related videos I've seen, everyone drinks each steeps of the tea separately. However, it's more convenient to steep the same tea multiple times, fill up the chahai, and then don't worry about the water cooling down until the whole pitcher of tea is consumed. Are there advantages of drinking different steeps separately? Am I missing out on something if I mix the steeps? So, yeah, we do tend to brew teas in the way that Lamau, that's how I'm just going to say the name, talks about, where we do individual steeps, and I can fit pretty much exactly one steep into this cup. And it is also true that for certain teas, they will vary a little bit steep to steep, and sort of parsing out the differences between the steeps can be a pretty interesting and informative way to drink the tea. That being said, I don't think there's anything wrong with stacking infusions, and in fact, I've had a number of tea sessions with people, especially when you reach a certain amount of people, where stacking infusions is just something that you have to do. So if I had to serve this using this pot for 4 people, I would definitely stack the infusions, even if I could use smaller cups. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily. You might miss out on a little bit of nuance. But yeah, and the other thing I'd point to is just with my ripe tea, I do also stack infusions frequently. It's just more convenient, a little bit more casual. So yeah, that's about that. And then I have one from sorry, I'm going to butcher this, Stare Dobra Memi. What's your favorite tea of each of the 6 categories, or 7 if you include Shu? Statistically, I drink semi-aged Store Puerh the most, by quite a margin, actually. I would say that and aged oolong are my probably absolute 2 favorites. I also really like Wooey oolong. I'd probably mention that up in there. For me, Wooey oolong is something that if I were really wealthy, I would probably drink way more often, because I think it's a fantastic tea for fantastic tea for a session. Once you factor in money, it becomes a little bit less fantastic, and I start to prefer other categories of teas. But if I could just buy tea irregardless of cost, getting really, really high quality Wooey oolong would be extremely appealing to me. Also like Taiwanese oolongs, for me that's more of like I'd classify it maybe a level beneath the Store Puerh and aged oolongs. Same thing goes for aged Pu'erh. I don't necessarily prefer semi-aged Sheng over aged Sheng. It's just, if you're going to be buying 30-year-old tea that's like not traditional stored, you need to have a pretty limitless bank account that is far beyond what I have. So this one's from Emil Renberg. So thank you, Emil. You've been following for a long time, so really appreciate you sticking with us for so long. So yes, I'm curious about having tips for coming back to tea after taking a break for a few hours. The leaves often feel dead after waiting a few hours between brews. Any advice? So yeah, I agree with Emil that the tea definitely does tend to feel a little different coming back to it after letting it just sit. Personally, I just don't do anything special. The tea is just, so for instance, I'm drinking this 2007 Wistaria Hongyan right here, and I just did steep number 4. Probably going to wait till after lunch to do steeps number 5 onwards. and the tea will feel different than if I just did steep number 5 right now. I don't know. I don't have an issue with the tea feeling too dead. It does feel different. Sometimes, actually, when I come back to tea, I actually find that it can be a little bit more reinvigorated in certain ways. So for me personally, one example I guess I would give is Wui Oolongs often do like up to 7 or so steeps, and I tend not to do more than that at once, and then I'll usually come back to it later, and I can find I can actually get a little bit extra longevity to it. So I'm not sure. It kind of depends what feeling dead means in this sense. The tea is just going to be a little bit different. Some people do store it in the fridge or things like that. I don't bother with that. I've never really bothered with that. So that could be one way. If you're coming back to it the next day in particular, it could feel quite different too. I'd almost put that into a different category. I tend not to do that so much, but that's more out of convenience and just how I drink it. All right, so Keyboard 12 asks your thought about drinking tea while having problems with sinuses. I need to have surgery. Now I think I can appreciate tea in 50% in comparison to what I could do if I had normal sinuses. Sorry to hear that, Keyboard. Hope you are doing well, and hope if you do have that surgery that it does go well. Aroma is definitely a big part about appreciating teas, but it does depend on the tea. I feel like there are some teas, such as very fresh tea, where aroma is a huge factor in the just sort of enjoyment of the teas. And I think there's ones where it matters still, but it matters less. Aged Pu'erh would be an example where, yes, I do enjoy the aroma of aged or even traditionally stored Pu'erh, but it's one of quite a few factors that I enjoy. So I guess I would say choosing teas that you enjoy that aren't so aroma-centric, I guess that would tend to be less oolongs. Stuff like ripe pu'erh for me would fit that category. When I'm sick, I tend to drink things like ripe pu'erh, partly because I don't want to waste better tea, and because just my full faculties aren't able to smell it. All right, this one is from Kevin John, who asks, I'm interested in that cast iron kettle that you use. This guy. So this is a Tetsubin. I got it from Artistic Nippon. I believe it cost slightly under $300 when I bought it, so not cheap by any means. And this is a just standard wearing hot plate. It's a way I enjoy making tea. I use it pretty regularly. Being in Seattle, I've never lived with AC, so I tend to decommission it over the summer and just go to a regular kettle before returning to it in the cooler months. It does produce sort of different tasting water. If I have boiled water here and boiled water here, it does taste different. I honestly don't have a great excuse, but I haven't fully explored that despite owning this for, probably 6 years at this point. It is on the list of potential episodes to do, so as I've been asked it before, I might do something like that. I enjoy how tea tastes coming out of this. Don't actually brew tea in this. I enjoy tea when I brew it with the water from this. Okay, so Furman asks, I feel like a tea. Some teas have a very complex aroma that quickly fades after a couple steeps. Do you have any insight on why that is? I don't know why that is, but I agree. I think a lot of aroma can often be really front-loaded. And I think that's part of the reason why during like a tasting of oolong teas or something, you might preheat your vessel, your pot, or your gaiwan, dump the leaves in, shake it up, and then have a smell, just so you can have that sort of extra aroma appreciation and sort of smelling after each steep. I do think it is front-loaded, and the complexity and the aroma can change maybe a fair amount depending on the tea in the first few steeps before really settling down. And when you're on steep like 8 or 9 for a Pu'erh, it's just going to be pretty darn steady, and the aroma will just slowly dissipate. So I don't know. I just kind of consider that to be sort of the inherent nature of tea. All right, so Catch Love asks, I currently use a 60 to 100 milliliter gallon or 60/100 milliliter gallon for everything and want to move to pots. How to match teas to clay and shape. Thoughts on silver, cups or otherwise. All right, so clays and shapes. Well, clay and silver are definitely a little bit beyond my expertise, so much so that I wouldn't want to comment too much. And I'm also going to be very clear, not an expert on teaware. But I guess in terms of shape, one thing to keep in mind is just sort of how the leaves fit. If I were to look at like doing a pairing a pot with like an oolong, such as a wooey or a dansang oolong, where the leaves are like long and thin, I wouldn't want like I would want like a long, thin pot with like sort of a wider base rather than something that's more structured upwards. So, and that's just for the leaves to expand and stuff like that. Another thing I'd pay attention to is also the pour. I think if you're trying to do something like, again, a wooey oolong or a dansang, where I think you're generally going to want a pretty fast pour and the ability to just unload the pot very quickly. Whereas something like traditionally stored or older shung pu'erh, you don't need that, or ripe for that matter, you don't need that level of precision. So paying attention to that, I think, is also important. I do like the 100 milliliter size. I've tended to gravitate towards that. I used to be sort of a 60/100 milliliter person as well, and I've just sort of gravitated more towards that 100 milliliter size just because it's just a little bit more convenient. You get a little bit more tea. Okay, so a few Pu'erh-centric ones. This one is from Kulatube. James, I noticed that many of your cakes are in plastic bags. Are you storing the cakes in the Eurocave and mini fridge in plastic bags as well? What kind of bags, and do you worry about drying out the cakes? So I do store some of my cakes, especially in my smaller, more accessible Pu'erh with plastic bags. Part of this, for me, is just a logistical convenience factor. I don't like having all my tea really loose in there. I am not a terribly clean person, I guess I would say, in terms of that. So I just know that I would make such a huge mess and lose a lot of tea if I just left all my cakes loose there. So for me, plastic bags are kind of a good way to sort of catch those leaves and stuff like that. I just also don't think of them as like fully sealed in the way that something like the Mylar bags that Marco is using in his experiment are. So I tend to think of them as like these bags will sort of condition to the ambient environment as well. One sort of example I would give of is I used to store a couple cakes just on my tea cabinet over there in a Ziploc bag, essentially, and like freezer bag Ziploc, so pretty good Ziploc bags. And I found that they slowly geared towards the ambient environment here. So for me, I think it's more important to create sort of that larger environment. In the Eurocave, which is more of my long-term storage that I don't open up very often at all, I do have a couple plastic bags in there, but it's mainly not. So I think it depends to me on the tea, and for me, a lot of it is convenience. Another reason that some people will store with plastic bags is to just control that aroma. Some people don't like the aromas intermixing. I tend to care a little bit less about this, but it's definitely another big reason why people will use plastic bags to store their teas. It's just sort of making sure their aromas don't intermix too much. Swopati asks, can you cover some of the regions, mountains for Pu'erh, and what they are known for? Taste, price, any other parameters you might think of. So this could be pretty much as big of a topic as you want. I'd refer to some of the earlier articles I've written on regions. I think I also did some videos a few years back on the different areas. I think the biggest regions are Xishuangbanna, Simao, and Linchang. Simao, sometimes known as Pu'erh Prefecture as well. I think Xishuangbanna is the traditional and arguably the most important one. Contains the Menghai County stuff, which is most of the Menghai teas, and on the eastern side contains Yiwu and that stuff. Price also tends to be a little bit higher in a place like Xishuangbanna versus Simao or Lincheng. Of course, you can have exceptions. Something like Bingdao, which demands very high prices, is in Lincheng. So there are variations within that, but that's sort of the generalization I would draw. And again, I would refer to sort of checking out the information on some of these older guides and stuff I've done and looking at the maps, because these days there are so many different mountains and subregions and villages and stuff like that. And I think it's important to be able to differentiate between what are the big ones, such as the prefectures I just outlined, versus what is like this micro village that's like on the border of Laos or something like that. All right, so Tabelli asks, how about a step-by-step guide on how you judge, evaluate a tea, smell, aroma, taste, and aftertaste? And then he also asks for a recommendation of two Sheng Pu'erhs that are as different as it gets from each other. I would say on judging, evaluating a tea, I think it's nothing crazy. Just break it down. Smell the tea, do aroma first, taste the tea, think about the taste and the texture, and then wait for a little bit longer and think about how it tastes now, the aftertaste. Do you taste sweetness in the throat? Do you taste it in the back of your mouth, in the front of your mouth? Is it still bitter? Is it sweet? So I think just rather than overwhelming you with, what's the smell, aroma, taste, aftertaste, I think just thinking about them individually tends to be helpful for me. I also don't claim to be a great evaluator or communicator for that matter in terms of just how different flavor notes and that kind of thing. As far as a recommendation goes, good question. I would say choosing something like an Yiwu and then something like a factory tea that's more semi-aged. So I don't know, like the Lishan Gongcha from Teas We Like and a Love Forever Paper Tong. Both pretty different from one another. Love Forever Paper Tong being more of a punchy factory tea, whereas the Lishan Gongcha is a very good quality Yiwu tea. All right, Nathaniel Welch again. Is it possible to drink aged raw pu'erh on a budget? What will the state of tea, especially in the U.S., look like post-COVID-19? How do you, again, from a U.S. perspective, determine which vendors are trustworthy? I realized that a vendor I thought was trustworthy had been doing some shady things, which made me reevaluate supporting them. Okay, state of tea, no idea. So many different factors going on. Right now, I feel like the thing that everyone's noticing is that shipping times from China is just really slow. This is probably not going to be a good thing for vendors. Also difficult for vendors based in the U.S., such as Crimson Lotus Tea, to sort of make their annual trips out there. So that's, I'm sure, quite frustrating to deal with. As far as trustworthiness, I think I would just read about the vendors. Some people would just say, taste the tea and form your own opinion. I find it more helpful personally, especially if you're starting out, to just sort of scour the internet for different opinions. I think it's pretty easy to figure out which vendors that we recommend here on TeaDB. Just look at the videos from the last couple of years, and those tend to be the vendors that we respect, we buy from, and that we like. So, the teas featured in TeaDB are not a random selection of teas that we get. It is it's partly, part of it is certainly chance and randomness, but a lot of it is also just what we like and what we prefer. We don't choose bad teas to bring onto the show, usually. The first question was, is it possible to drink aged raw pu'erh on a budget? In my opinion, yes. A lot of this depends on what you would consider aged. Some people, and I don't suspect that's the case for most people that follow our channel, would only consider something really truly aged when it's like 25 or 30 years old and stored in a place like Southeast China or in like Guangzhou or Hong Kong or Malaysia. So it does depend on what you consider aged. I think most people in the U.S. would even consider, in the West rather, would consider semi-aged tea, so 7+ years old, to be somewhat aged. And in my opinion, absolutely possible to find those teas for a very reasonable price. I think they can often be even less expensive than teas that are young. Pu'erh prices, Malchow prices have gone up a lot in price. So yeah, it's definitely possible to find it. I think more of the issue is that there is a lot of the tea that gets brought to the Western market. I would estimate around 85% of it ends up being Yangsheng. All right, and the last question was emailed me by Brandon. He says he had 2 questions. He says, water. I've tried at least 20 different combinations of different waters and without added minerals. My tea tastes bland or overly unpleasant, and it's extremely difficult to find nice flavor profiles. What gives? I think it's really hard to diagnose this without just seeing how the tea is brewed or getting more specifics. It could be the water. It could be the tea. If you're, for instance, in altitude, if you're like higher, like in the mountains, water will boil at a lower temperature and it's just going to taste inherently different. So I don't know. It could just be the tea's not very good, or it could be the water. Sorry. It's a pretty distinctly unhelpful answer here, but just hard to say without even knowing where Brandon is based. Storage. I have some things from Kunming Storage and U.S. Warehouse Storage that have no taste whatsoever. Assuming it's from this issue and not water, how important is storage to tea strength? What's best? Best Pomodoro temp relative humidity recommendation. So I would say storage, both short-term and long-term, are very important to determining the character of a raw pu'erh tea in particular. I think it just bears a really large impact, and I think people that choose to ignore it are I don't know. I mean, it's fine, but they are ignoring a pretty important parameter to how the tea's character is what it is. So if there's no vibrancy to the tea, I think the default diagnosis tends to be that the tea has been dried out. One way to tell if this is the case is to follow a sort of measurement that Marco does, where you take a Mylar bag, you put your cake in there, and you put a hygrometer in there, and you seal it, and then you see what that relative humidity is a couple days later. If the relative humidity is beneath 60 or so, I'd say there's a good chance that the tea is dried out. If it's above 70 or so, the tea might actually be a little bit too humid. And between 60 or 70, I don't know, that tends to be a more acceptable relative humidity generated by the tea. So yeah, that's what I would say. I'd say in particular, coming from both those places, Kunming and US too, that would lead me towards sort of thinking about it being a more of a drying out issue. And I do think it can certainly affect the tea's character, the vibrancy, so the aroma, the strength of it as well. A tea that's too dried out may have very little aroma. It can taste flat, overly astringent. As far as parameters such as temperature or relative humidity, I think temperature, we can be quite flexible. I think generally speaking, the lowest you want to go is room temperature. So something like 60 or 65 would be at the very low end. I personally like storage that can get pretty hot. I've tasted a couple of Marco's teas that have been, I think, around 90 Fahrenheit or so. And for me, that's totally fine. I enjoy that tea. So unless you're doing heated storage, I don't know if, discerning the differences between 80 degrees, 90 degrees, and 100 degrees are that important. But in my opinion, you can go quite high for temperature. The ideal probably depends on your taste. As far as relative humidity, I think a good middle ground is around 65 relative humidity. I wouldn't sweat it too much if you're just a little bit below that, as long as it's above 60 or so. So yeah, that's about what I would say. So thank you again to Brandon for sending in that question, and thank you to everyone else. Let me know how you enjoyed this episode. Hope to do another one of these in another month or two. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you next time.